Hello and welcome back. Thank you very much, Jessica, for that presentation. We're now going straight into a panel session and a very hot topic in this conference today. It's on addressing cell and gene treatment affordability in the post-COVID world. I am delighted to welcome to the stage Don Creighton, who is the Managing Director of Huron Consulting, who has in-depth knowledge of payer systems and helps organizations to develop sound pricing and market access strategies. So I'm going to pass it straight over to Don to welcome the other speakers and to lead the discussion today. Welcome, Don.
Great. Thank you, Izzy, and welcome to everyone from the virtual world. So I'll just get right to it in terms of the discussion. If we can move to the next slide. In terms of the topics, once I go through the topics, I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into it. Today's discussion is around affordability, as mentioned. One, to assess the economic stress on payers caused by the pandemic and the knock-on effect this could have on access to therapies. We see that a lot of things around affordability have in the past have been, if not if, but when. But we do see COVID being an accelerant to a lot of things out there in terms of both policy as well as what we'll be talking about around manufacturer, payer agreements, arrangements, payment models. So we see that as an important context here. Also around affordability in terms of really thinking about those new paradigms with the models and how you include government, payers, pharma primarily in this process. What are those new routes to reimbursement? What are those payment models that really the payers are really looking at as it relates to cell and gene therapies? And what are some of the performance metrics and timeframes in which really they see as viable. And then finally, in terms of preparing for the affordability issues and obstacles going forward, what can industry do to really address that proactively? So we're going to have a pretty thorough conversation around sort of the context of payment models and alike, and what payers are thinking about this, what industry's thinking about that. Mark from MIT NEWDIGS will provide some context around that. We'll be talking about value demonstration and evidence development, and Nick will be covering that from UniQure. Will be covering that, and we also want to talk about the value chain and sort of how industry has really been brought into more of the value chain here as it relates to diagnosis and delivery, as well as access. And so Lung-Yi will talk about that in terms of sort of Takeda's efforts in that space. Of course, we want to address the question of affordability specifically, and we do have a survey that we'll ask the audience to respond to as it relates to, what do you see or what do you consider as the key obstacles and challenges. So without further ado, let's introduce the panel, and then next slide, please. So Lung-Yi.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to Reuters for organizing this meeting and the invitation. My name is Lung-Yi Cheng. I'm part of Takeda's Global Oncology organization. I lead our value and access efforts for cell therapies.
Thank you. Mark?
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you virtually today. I'm Mark Trusheim. I'm Strategic Director at MIT NEWDIGS, where I help steward our financing of cures in the US, or FOCUS program, which is a multi-stakeholder consortium where we look at the financing issues after the value has been set, presuming that no matter how that discussion goes, these will be highly valuable and highly priced products. So what do you do then after that? And I'll look forward to sharing some of those insights with you later.
Thank you, Mark. Nick?
Thank you, Don, and thank you, Reuters, for inviting me to this panel discussion. I'm Nick Lee. I'm a senior director and I lead the health economics and outcome research team at UniQure, a leading gene therapy company. My work here is centered around demonstrating the value of our innovative gene therapy pipeline products and also achieving optimum patient access to those therapies. Happy to share what I've learned over the past few years working at UniQure in this gene therapy patient access space.
Great. Thank you. And just in terms of an introduction for myself, I've been in the pricing and market access space for approximately 20 years, split between consulting and industry. I spent 9 years at Pfizer, including time as a global market access lead in the specialty care business unit, as well as the oncology business unit. And now I work for Huron as a managing director. We have approximately 3,800 consultants who work in healthcare across life sciences, but also in the hospital space and in the institutions and within medical research. Okay, great. So just a little bit of context here in terms of what we're talking about today. If we can move to the next slide, please. Great. So we really think in terms of cell and gene therapies, this has been a disruptive space in terms of healthcare delivery and the pharma business model, as I alluded to before, in terms of the value chain. So the context around the business model is unique, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about that earlier today, and some of the challenges and opportunities around that type of business model. Again, I think Lung-Yi will talk to the extent in terms of thinking about the value chain. And as we talk about the traditional model for healthcare delivery, this is a very unique one, and one in which the industry, again, is taking a much more hands-on approach as it relates to that process. And then finally here, in terms of the uncertainty and value and affordability, we're talking about a very significant price point here. And particularly when you're talking about a one-time treatment, there has to be a level of certainty around what the value you're bringing to a patient, to a plan, to a health system, to a society. And we're not quite there yet in terms of gene therapies on an individual basis, in terms of sort of the efficacy effectiveness. So what we are seeing is an interest in these payment models that help address some of that uncertainty, particularly from the clinical side, and also in some regards helping with the bolus of payments that can be upfront and can be very difficult for payers' health systems. So helping to try to absorb some of those costs upfront, as we've seen, for example, with Luxturna. Next slide, please. So as we put it in the roundtables that we have on this and talking to our clients, there's because the cell and gene therapy area doesn't fit in the traditional sort of space as it relates to affordability, delivery and provider economics, or even capturing data and real world value. Really, there's elements that need to be considered as it relates to systemic solutions. One is, as I mentioned, the risk sharing mechanisms. Another is really thinking about outcomes-based contracts, treatment delivery standardization, as well as long-term patient follow-up and mechanisms to basically track those patients. And with those, then taking those into consideration, our perspective is if industry does incorporate those well, then you can have a successful venture forward in this space. Next slide, please. So there's specific aspects in terms of the stakeholders, in terms of what we call curative treatments, but just long-term treatments with long-term efficacy, which there is a very common goal as it relates to improving the outcomes for these patients. And as we know, patients, physicians, society, they're looking for cures. And really that is not really the challenge here. It's around the affordability and access issue. And I think there's been a lot of questions already in this this meeting around these. So I think from all levels, including physicians, patients, government, payers, as well as manufacturers, again, there are common goals, but how to address that affordability issue is key. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go into this in detail because Mark is going to cover this in the next step. But one of the ways to, again, address that creatively and proactively in terms of affordability issues relates to these options that could be either at the product level or portfolio level, and they can be also at the patient or population level. So these are just general examples, again, I think that Mark will cover in his presentation. But really, as it relates to what your space in terms of your disease area, there may be distinctions in terms of how you want to go forward. And there's also, in terms of the stakeholders, the payers, there may be interest in pursuing one type of agreement versus another. And we also have to remember that this is a very heterogeneous population. So one payer may prefer one type of solution, whereas another may prefer a different one. So important to keep in mind in this process as we think about this. Okay, so I have this next slide is it's a poll, and the question we have here is, what is the most significant challenge in addressing affordability issues regarding cell and gene therapies? Please choose one of these. Reimbursement policy, so issues around best price, and that being a hurdle. Portability, beneficiaries moving from one plan to another. Tracking, monitoring, performance metrics, or trust between payers and manufacturers, or other. So if you could please respond. Okay. So we're going to hear from our panelists in terms of their perspective on this. So just to let the group know, reimbursement policy, people are still answering, but reimbursement policy is the first. We're going to have Mark discuss that later in terms of the legislation that's going forward to try to address some things like best price. Portability, 28%, sorry, that's 43% now for reimbursement policy, portability, 27%, performance metrics, pretty much the same at 26, 27%, payer manufacturing trust at 3%, and then other at 1%. So it sounds like I was pretty, at least in terms of like suggesting the ones that were an issue, it seems like I've hit on the ones that are concerned to people. So hopefully we'll address those today in our conversation. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to discuss focus and MIT NEWDIGS work in this space.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Don. Great job in setting this up and for bringing us all together today. So as you can tell from the clever acronym, focus is financing and reimbursement of cures in the US, and the threading the needle, as you just saw from these questions from Don, there's many implementation hurdles that all have to get worked through, as well as Don did a great job of walking through all the various stakeholders that also has to be satisfied through this. So our multi-stakeholder consortium has about 100 organizations, from payers to patients, from developers to regulators and policymakers, as well as provider systems. Next slide, please, Izzy. We've been around since about 2016 working on this. Next slide, Izzy, if you could. Thank you. And what we see is that, first of all, when we began this, people thought there might be 2,000 products coming down the frame because the payers and everyone was very enthusiastic. So being MIT nerds, we dove into the pipeline and did a projection going forward. And we think there'll be, in this durable therapy space, out of the 740 currently active programs, we think by 2030, somewhere between 50 and 75 of those will reach the market across a variety of indications, about 184. And you'll notice the fine print that we excluded China from this. There were many Chinese, particularly CAR-T programs that seemed to be for local use only, and we excluded those. And as Don hinted on the right-hand side, there's this huge challenge of the upfront payment compared to a more classic medicine. But that's not the only financial challenge that these present. So certainly that payment timing and one-time high cost is important and gets everyone's attention. But as we've also heard already today, there's questions about the performance of these therapies. Will they work for everyone who takes them or just a fraction, because the trials are often small? So we're not really sure about that. And how long will they last? Will it be 2, 3 years, 5 years, a lifetime? We're still very uncertain about this. And a surprise for many of us was there's a huge actuarial risk for particularly mid-sized insurer plans of 1 million, 2 million lives or smaller, where for many of these products, you don't know how many patients you're actually going to receive. And that leads to an income statement volatility because of the price point that many of them find challenging. So those were the 3 big challenges at the end of the day that we thought needed to be solved after you agreed on what the price might be. Next slide, please, Izzy. So, that was great. Thank you. Yeah. So we went out in 2019, about a year ago now, a year and a half ago. We talked to 153 US payers, and we really want to thank Huron, who was our partner in that. They really helped us get out there. So thank you, Don, to your organization as well. And out of that, we found nearly everyone a year ago already, year and a half ago, was extremely or highly concerned about these products coming forward. Which, to give you a sense, we did the same survey the year before in about 2018, early 2018, and we had as many people not knowing what these products were as there were people who knew them and were concerned about them. So there's been a huge and rapid development in only a year and a half in awareness. Next slide. And the tools that they'd like to see, because of all these implementation challenges that many of you have already weighed in on the survey, is really thinking that they like shorter things first. And as the slide got pushed over, you'll notice some of the columns don't have titles to them. So let me tell you that 71% is indeed centers of excellence. The 60% is really shorter milestone contracts. So these sort of 1-year things we've seen in CAR-T and other places. The risk pools, the 46% is a longer milestone contract. Performance-based annuities, and at the end, what people don't really have much interest in is just a pay over time installment plan without any connection to either some risk pooling and particularly that performance stuff. So shorter is better, although I think that's changing as we'll talk about the policy issues, maybe making longer term things more possible soon. Next slide. So we call these precision financing approaches, as you see on the left-hand side, slightly different language than what Don used, but much the same thing. Short-term milestone contracts, warranty models, multi-year performance annuities, these risk pool carve-out ideas, and a subscription model, it's there without the performance attribute to it. I think people are very interested in subscription models if you could put some performance basis in it, but not much without that. And you'll see the little circles that none of these solutions fully address all of the 3 main issues. So there's still work to be done, and different payers of different sizes emphasize one versus another so they can appreciate this and see that many of their needs are being met. Medicaid payers have very different issues than self-insured employers, which are different again from Medicare and commercial risk-bearing plans. And you'll see in the US that we're having challenges implementing some of these, particularly the multi-year programs have been stalled by Medicaid best price. There's been some state demonstrations on subscription models in hepatitis C, but not really in this durable cell and gene therapy space yet. So you get a sense of great progress, initial steps, lots more perhaps to combine these, and look forward to your questions and ideas. Next slide, Izzy. So I'd encourage you to go out and look at our payingforcures.org website where there's a number of resources out there. I'll particularly draw your attention to the online toolkit on the top right-hand side, where you see there's some spreadsheets and other things to help you model things, but also just really great descriptions by stakeholder view, whether you're a developer, a patient, a payer. There's a view and a walk through the issues for that stakeholder perspective. So, and all of our, of course, academic publications there, of course, and where we'll be speaking. Next slide, if you could, Izzy. Payingforcures.org. And I'll close here with coming back to what these payers told us a year and a half ago, which was over the next 2 years, they thought they had to really start stepping up and addressing these challenges. So that means this year and next are the years we think the payers are serious about really partnering with developers, listening to patients, figuring out how to work with providers, all in a way that meets regulatory requirements to solve these multiple financing challenges that are unique to these durable cell and gene therapies. So thanks very much. Hope that was fast, but not so fast that we lost you. Lot to think through. But before we jump into the implementation, it's always great to know what are we really trying to solve for in the first place. Thanks again.
So, Mark, maybe you could, because it is so important to the group in terms of the thinking around reimbursement policies such as best price, if you could offer some context in terms of legislative policies pending to address some of the affordability challenges.
Sure. So the biggest movement this summer was from CMS itself. It wasn't actually on the legislative side. So many of you may know that CMS has a proposed rule that came out in late June with comment period very short by mid or late July that addressed Medicaid best price, where they will actually now put in multiple tiered Medicaid best prices to address some of the challenges of these performance contracts. So now you can say with some greater assurance, if I give a very large discount to a patient to whom the therapy doesn't respond particularly well, that new low price, that high discount for that one patient won't somehow become the only reportable transaction for that payer, which therefore becomes the new lowest price for the national Medicaid side. So it's sort of an arcane problem, but CMS has taken, we think, some good faith efforts to try to solve it. Not perfect. They had many comments back and coming back. We know they're trying to work hard on it quickly. We'll see if it gets done before the end of the year, but there's some rumor that they're trying to push that hard, but it's very complicated. So it may last a little bit longer. On the legislative side, the Senate side has one or two proposals, one of which is to completely exempt cell and gene therapies from Medicaid best price. Another is to allow Medicaid itself to experiment more, but does little for the commercial side of the House. And the House side, as opposed to the Senate, has similar sorts of approaches, but they're not so in favor of simply exempting these therapies. They have a couple other tweaks that they're thinking through. Of course, this legislative season has a lame duck session, and then we'll see what the next group says. But those ideas are still circulating, as is in the back halls a bit of a thought that, particularly for pediatric conditions that cause state Medicaid a lot of challenge, that the federal government simply risk pool. You saw Don talk about risk pooling and things. Here would be a combination of both pooling nationally and perhaps some greater subsidization or simply cost shifting up to the federals for the Medicaid side. It doesn't seem to be getting a lot of traction, but it's still being talked about.
Great context, Mark. And to your point, some people may not have noticed, but there is an election happening tomorrow, so that certainly can have implications on how we move forward. So should be interesting.
I'm wearing my purple shirt for the day. You know, I'm not going to signal anything or make any assumptions one way or the other.
Okay. So I'm going to hand it over to Nick from UniQure. He's going to talk to us about value demonstration, a patient-centric approach. And also, we're asking him to talk a bit about the implications related to the value framework, such as ICER and ISPOR value flower. Nick, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Don. And I think it just as Mark mentioned, they're like a focus initiative, really focus on the financing side. From a manufacturer's perspective, there's both the value component and the financing component. the work that I have been centered around doing at the UniQure is really on the value demonstration side. This is really critical. We're already seeing the cell and gene therapy, particularly gene therapy, comes as the price tag that in the close to $1 million, or in certain therapies is already multi-million type of therapy. So then how can we really justify for such a high price tag that we are putting onto those therapy? What is the value justification for those therapies? I think these days the pharma industry and biotech generally have adopted to use this value-based pricing philosophy. Then if the price is linked to the value, then it's really of a paramount importance from a manufacturer's perspective, really to demonstrate what is the value underlying those very innovative cell and gene therapy that we are developing. The value comes in different forms and shapes, right? So there's of course a clinical value, improving survival, improving the long-term clinical outcomes. There is a humanistic value. The patients, the caregiver, the family members will substantially get a much better life or improve the quality of life coming out of this. And also there's economic value. Believe it or not, in certain disease areas, there's actually opportunities for those cell and gene therapies to create a win-win, because just the standard of care currently available for those therapies are very, very expensive. Certainly, for example, the hemophilia disease area where UniQure is in a late stage gene therapy product has the standard of care already is in the ballpark of $500,000 to $1 million a year. And then this is a patient, what they need to do is lifetime treatment. So over a patient's life course, we may be looking at over $20 million cost for the single patient. And thinking about a single administration would be able to have the potential to take, if not most of them or even all of them away, that cost savings from a payer side could be substantial. So therefore, this is very important to demonstrate holistically what are the value of a therapy from clinical, economic, and also the humanistic perspective, understanding, helping the payers, the patients, the society understand better about what's the burden, what's the unmet need, and therefore why we need those innovative cell and gene therapies to really address those problems. I think just probably using the UniQure's approach, and then when it comes to value and access, the patient-centric approach is of really paramount importance in this field, that because a lot of the cell and gene therapy are being developed for diseases, certainly rare diseases, where there's already very educated, very mobilized patient advocacy community, it's important to be really working with the patients, having this paradigm shift, thinking about them as the partners rather than just participants of the trials. Working with them, we have been really inviting the patients to conduct patient advocacy and provide into our clinical pivotal trial design, including as well as using the patient report outcome instrument that will actually develop by patients for patients compared to a few academic or psychometricians type of tools. We've been working with the patients side by side in our early economic modeling work, in a lot of the patient preference, patient understanding, or patient expectations for gene therapy type of work, to making sure that the patient perspective is fully incorporated into the drug development as well as the commercialization process. I'm going to just wrap up with just a few points regarding the ICER or these SST framework. I think that to most of the audience here at this Congress today, ICER is an entity that nobody can just, we just play the, pretend that they don't exist. In fact, just last Friday, ICER did the public hearing of investigational hemophilia A gene therapy manufactured by BioMarin, and it was a very interesting discussion. For those of you who haven't seen it, I think they will be posting the video online pretty soon. The ICERs have a very unique approach coming up with what they call the SST, or single and short-term transformative therapies. They're trying to incorporate some of those value component, particularly that's may not be traditionally true for the other chronic therapies, such as a value of hope, such as the scientific spillover. So how do we incorporate those additional components of value into the ICER assessment framework, into how the payers and HTA view those therapies, is of very much importance. And that's, I think, up to really the cause for the collaboration between the industry, the patient community, the physician community, and also the payer and the policymakers to really get together to think about how can we maybe fully incorporate those innovative values of cell and gene therapy into the overarching conversation.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I'm gonna move on to Lung-Yi as I think it's important to get the context in terms of the value chain as well. And we do have a question I would kindly ask him to address around the affordability around the allogenic therapies. So take it away, Lung-Yi.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, Nick and Mark, for setting this up so nicely for me. So next slide, please. So let's dive right in. Thinking about COVID-19, I think it's important to start the conversation from the patient's perspective, specifically on the physical access to treatment facilities. As this map shows, patients and physicians alike are faced with a difficult choice when the treatment center is located where the pandemic is most severe. So the question then becomes, how do we keep the connectivity with care for cell and gene therapy? Next slide. There are a number of macro trends that we're seeing when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 on access. Affordability challenges will cause payers to rethink their budget allocation, especially for high-cost cell and gene therapies. At the same time, this could open up more opportunities to collaborate on value-based contracting. And while the focus of today's panel is on affordability and innovative contracting, it will be a remiss not to highlight additional market dynamics, such as an increased focus on economic assessments at a system level, and the prioritization of reimbursement decisions for drugs that really bring the most value to the healthcare system. Next slide. The fact of the matter is, while currently available cell therapies bring huge benefits to patients, they're complex to make, with long turnaround time and risk of manufacturing failure. Safety management and monitoring also limits the adaptation of these therapies. Therefore, from a technological perspective, how do we move away from that and into a more allogeneic world where the time from treatment decision to infusion is shorter, where safety monitoring is less burdensome, and where access to cell therapy is broader? Next slide. I think ultimately innovative contracting needs to go hand in hand with value demonstration. So along the value chain, we see many areas of opportunities at Takeda that could be improved upon. I'll start from the 3 o'clock of the graphic here. So how do we keep patients local and maintain that connectivity with care? How do we shorten the time to treatment and eliminate bridging therapy? How do we free up hospital beds, ER, and ICU with a safer product? How do we have a more streamlined supply chain? How do we focus more on the total cost of care instead of individual drug cost? Finally, and more importantly, how do we unlock the promise of cell therapy and enable broader access to innovation? So those are my opening comments.
Great. Thank you, Lung-Yi. Okay. So I just wanted to follow up with a couple of the points made already. So Nick, if I may ask you, in considering your proactive preparation of value evidence, demonstration evidence requirements, what type of data or endpoints are key from an access payer perspective? And do you have a point of view as to what's appropriate for a trial versus observational studies?
Yeah, that's a great. So I think overall, from a payer engagement perspective, this is early engagement is really the key, and helping the payers understand what kind of burdens they are facing, what kind of cost implications for some of those diseases is really of paramount importance. For example, if the payers thinking about a lot of things we are discussing during the panel today, the outcome-based contracting, the innovative type of agreement, all of those actually require, first of all, payers understand how the patients on their plan looking like, or what's the annual cost looks like, how are they managing it currently, and then in the previous engagement that we have done with the payers, we found a surprisingly high percentage of payers actually do not have a good understanding of what's happening with those patients. So from a manufacturer's perspective, one way that we have been really trying to help the payers is to come up with a very easy to use type of algorithm or type of other tools that can really help payers go back to their own data and understand, okay, so this is how much these patients is costing me already on annual basis. This is what kind of challenges these patients are facing from access to care perspective. And then this is where we will be able to open up for the conversation on how from a cell and gene therapies manufacturer perspective, how we would be able to provide help.
Mark, so there's a comment regarding performance metrics and how that's the most difficult challenge because of the patient condition response and the spectrum across patients. So I'll ask you if you have any insights or context around that, and then Nick or Lungi if they have anything to add.
So what we found in our consortium at Focus is our members sort of divide into two camps. One is very scientific and they want very accurate readings, often down to blood tests and these sorts of things, which are phenomenal, often very well connected to functional outcomes, but very difficult to gain access to. And others are in the very practical, if it's close enough, we can make it work and we'll adjust some of the rebate numbers to make it all work out. And they, for example, in hemophilia would just assume, let's just look at factor 8 and 9 billings, right? And if the therapy is working, I shouldn't see him use a hemophiliac using factor 8 or 9. If I see a little bit, I'll cut you some slack from a payer to a developer. If I see significant amounts, I want some kind of a performance rebate. And all I have to do is run a billing report, right? And so those two tensions between being really accurate and also trying to get even the patient-reported functional status outcomes versus something very easy to administer is really the challenge that we see in this. And it comes down to data and data access. So with work and hope, maybe we can get much better access to much better data over time. But in these next couple years, practicality seems to be winning out over complete accuracy on these.
Okay. Anything to add, Nick or Lungi, on that one? Yeah. My sense is from talking to payers that they want something simple and trackable, and it really makes sense in terms of to really understand they're getting value for money as it relates to the metric chosen, but also with that context in terms of the spectrum of response, there needs to be a agreement. And as we talked about in our pre-panel discussion, is like the devil's in the details as far as some of that goes, and it varies. And so that's one question I did want to ask also in terms of sort of cell and gene therapies are not created equally. Lungi, from your perspective, what are some of the distinctive factors to consider regarding affordability?
Yeah, so again, we talked about kind of the system level thinking. How do you look at total cost of care? I think what's really unique about cell and gene therapy is that there's so many stakeholders. I think at Takeda, we're in a fortunate position in that we actually launched a cell therapy, alofazole, in Europe in 2018. So through that experience, we have a lot of learnings at the enterprise level. What we're doing right now is really talking to these stakeholders early, more frequently, and making sure that there's like diversity of perspectives in the feedback that we're collecting. I'll give you an example, right? So for Medicare patients in the US right now that need cell therapies, whether your physician is located at the IPPS exempt hotel versus not, makes a huge difference on your payment level. So even just thinking about affordability, you really need to think about the different stakeholders that are being involved in the treatment process.
Great. And there's a question around setting of care, specifically around buy and bill and outpatient. It's one of the bullet points that I had that I quickly went through in mind in terms of practice economics and how important it is to ensure that physicians are not underwater. So I'll just open this to the group. Is this something that's been discussed in in any of your discussions around your strategy.
So I guess I could start looking here.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very important topic for the US system.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is that you need to think about the ways of centers and physicians that will be adopting your therapy, and how does that line up with your distribution strategy? Because ultimately you want to make this as easy as possible. So you could potentially have a more limited strategy, but that's not preferred by your customers. So I think this is something that we all should be thinking about. Ultimately, what does your customer want, and how do you work together with them to make this much easier, and therefore translating to broader access to innovation?
Yeah, I would echo what Lin said. This is Nick here. When it comes to the 340B or buy and bill, this is really tied to the distribution strategy that the company are thinking of putting together in the upcoming launch of those cell and gene therapies. It's of really important to recognize the different stakeholders here, what are their different perspectives, what's their preference when it comes to different type of distribution models. And then also from a manufacturer's perspective, what we hope is be able to deliver those therapies in a very efficient and easy to use perspective to the treatment centers that will eventually be adopting those therapies, and also hopefully be able to provide going back to this affordability talk that we started with, making sure that the patient would be able to have access to those therapies. And so all those are part of the equation when we need to consider, and of course, devils is in the details of how we operationalize some of those specific contract with different treatment centers, with a different specialty distributor versus a specialty pharmacy. That's it's a lot of details to cover, but nonetheless, the philosophy or the strategies that what we are putting together right now will help pave the way for effective distribution and access.
Yeah, and Don, if I can slip in 20 seconds, just the CAR-Ts have shown the difference between a Medicare and a commercial marketplace. Payer type is very important. So Medicare has been very hamstrung with the DRG process, where the commercial payers have managed to strike different deals of carving out the CAR-T product and still reimbursing their transplant centers appropriately. So payer type has also become very important in these discussions.
Izzy, do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, one more quick one. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there was a lot of discussion earlier around patient services, and we of course don't want to forget the patients, and so it ties back to the discussion around the data, performance metrics. Is there an opportunity to engage with patient organizations, advocacy groups, as it relates to the collection of data to help facilitate this process? So it's not all in the hands of either the manufacturer or the payer.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Nick. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, absolutely. Many of the patient groups see themselves as the natural holders and of this data, particularly when there's multiple products coming through. Surprisingly, the FDA has been funding NEWDIGS to develop patient registries for a number of rare conditions that we might be able to leverage going forward. But Nick, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I totally echo what you said, Mark. This is where the patient advocacy organizations, even themselves, are recognizing in order to really provide this data-driven or evidence-based care, they have a much bigger role to play besides the education advocacy. A number of patient organizations that we have worked with, including, for example, National Hemophilia Foundation is launching their own patient registry, providing 360 view of the patient's experience living with this disease and how their voice can be incorporated into the manufacturer's development as well as the overall policy discussions. So I do think this is an area that I think patient advocacy organizations are already recognizing the importance and will play an even bigger role moving forward.
Great. Okay, so I think we're at time. I apologize to those questions for the audience for the questions that we didn't get to. But I want to thank Reuters and of course the panelists here in terms of their perspective, and hopefully this was helpful session for those out there. Izzy?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Don, for moderating a great session, and also to Nick Lee, Mark, and Lungi. I'm sure if you have any additional questions that you want answered, I'm sure Huron would be delighted to speak to you. And so do get in touch with them if you do have some things that you want to talk about. So next to the stage is David Lennon, who's the president at Novartis Gene Therapies. He's going to be talking to me about the scaling of gene therapies. After that, we'll have Alberto Sangostino, who's the SVP head of cell and gene therapies at Lonza Pharma and Biotech, on the creativity in manufacturing. After that, we'll bring them both together. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So please join me for that and keep your questions coming. But first, welcome, David.